Welcome to Consider This. An ancient Egyptian burial ground known as Maidoum, located around 45 miles south of modern-day Cairo, is often overlooked by tourists, but to the Egyptologist, its importance is immense. The site contains an early, now broken pyramid and several mud brick mastabas. The pyramid, known as the Broken Pyramid, was Egypt's first straight-sided attempt at the iconic pyramid style. It is supposed, or at least suggested, by those who know about such things, that the original structure may have been built by the pharaoh Huni, the last pharaoh of the 3rd dynasty, as a step pyramid, but continued as a redesign of sorts by Pharaoh Sneferu, the first pharaoh of the 4th dynasty, and this is important for reasons we will look into shortly. The site also contains mastabas housing the remains of some of Sneferu's children. For example, Ra Nefer, his name meaning Ra, the sun god, is beautiful, and his elder brother Nefer Mart, his name meaning Mart, goddess of truth, harmony, balance and divine order, is beautiful. Their wives were also buried here along with other family members, and some smaller mastabas dot the landscape for their officials. Traditionally, a mastaba is a type of ancient Egyptian tomb, taking the form of a built-up rectangular structure with inward sloping sides, topped with a flat roof. These were usually constructed out of some hardened mud brick or limestone. These structures marked the burial sites of many royal and distinguished Egyptians during Egypt's early dynasties and Old Kingdom period. In latter times, people of a lesser social standing would also be buried within their own mastaba. The mastaba often contained a small chapel where the family of the deceased, along with priests, would bring food and other offerings thought to be useful to the deceased in their afterlife. The interior of most mastabas consisted of a deep chamber hollowed out of the ground, with its walls, floors and ceilings strengthened with stone, often limestone or sometimes stone intertwined with mud brick. The chamber that contained the body was dug as deep as possible into the ground. Mastaba 16, by far the largest mastaba at Maidoum, is the final resting place of Sneferu's eldest son, Nefermart, and his wife, Atet. In this case, the mastaba is built from mud brick, with the inner walls lined with limestone. 2 small chapels were set into the eastern part of the mastaba, one for Nefermart and the other for Atet. The chapels were decorated with scenes of hunting, fishing, farming and displaying a scene known as the Maidoum geese, which today is considered to be one of the greatest works of art from the Old Kingdom era. They're now housed at the Egyptian Museum and really worth a visit. But by far the most mysterious mastaba at Maidoum is labelled quite simply Mastaba 17 and sits much closer to the early Broken Pyramid than any other. There is no chapel in this mastaba and no entrance, which means this tomb was never meant to be visited with gifts. But why? It was the late great Sir Flinders Petrie that persevered at this site, and on his second archaeological dig there managed to find a way into the deep underground burial chamber, although sadly grave robbers, possibly the same men that had built the chamber, had already plundered the tomb. Of the mastaba, Petrie states, "Its outside was built of large crude bricks, the body of it formed of clean chips of limestone. Evidently the waste from the building of the pyramid. It's therefore most probably contemporary with the pyramid." He goes on to say, The whole length of the east side was laid bare and examined in search of any facade or false door, but it was all made of smoothly plastered brick. Pietri describes the find, stating, "On examination of the left radius and ulna, the two bones of the lower arm, it was found that no particle of flesh or skin intervened anywhere between the wrapping and the bones, the linen lying directly on the bone." This description was taken as direct evidence for the defleshing of the deceased. Another notable feature of these human remains is the small amount of an internal organ wrapped in linen. This appears to be one of the earliest, if not the earliest, example of taking the organs out of the body before mummification in Egypt. The mastaba was also unique for its era because it housed the oldest granite sarcophagus so far found anywhere in Egypt, and this was unparalleled. According to Pietri, 100,000 tons of stones and fresh lime chippings were carefully laid to construct this superstructure. Yet Nile mud was found as a filling to top his eldest son's, Nefermart's mastaba. All this information only brings questions still puzzled over to this day, and these questions are what we will now consider. Of the finds found within Mastaba 17, Pietri states, "The body was buried with wooden model insignia, consisting of a mace and two crooks, one of which only a portion remained. The sticks, a part of the mace handle, were apparently of cedar, and the crooks of sycamore, not bent round, but cut out of a straight board. The crooks, in one case, was painted yellow, the other was too perished to show any trace of colour. There was also with the body a wood carving of the pendant tag of the kilt, 7.3 inches long, and the knot 4.4 inches long, with which the kilt had been represented as fastened. In other words, this mummy was dressed for the afterlife." While Nefermart had beautiful paintings adorning the walls of his chapel, his body also showed signs of being defleshed before wrapped. In Ranefer's tomb were found remains of some inner organs wrapped in linen, and just as a point of note, Ranefer's body is considered the best representation of what mummification techniques entailed during the Old Kingdom. Ranefer's body was facing east and was moulded as well as painted. His genitals were also carefully moulded to be a part of the mummy. The brain remained in the skull. Other innards were found in a canopic chest inside the tomb. While all three mummies, Nefermart, Ranefer and our mystery man, show signs of defleshing, the former two mummies were individually wrapped once, while our mystery man had each bone wrapped individually and then again wrapped as one whole. Moreover, their mastabas are not in such a prime position to the pyramid, neither are they so well made, nor their sarcophagi fashioned from granite. Whoever was set to rest eternal in Mastaba 17 was of vast importance, perhaps to Sneferu himself, or maybe to Sneferu's predecessor, Pharaoh Huni. Whoever this man was, he was buried with dignity and secrecy. There were no names, hieroglyphs, nor etchings on the wall of the mastaba, neither inside nor out. Mastaba 17 is not the only secretive burial at my tomb. In fact, there are several. However, these underground, unmarked tombs, which do not boast a mastaba and were not equal in calibre to the tomb at Mastaba 17, may suggest the tomb owners simply died before their tombs were complete, and so we should not worry ourselves with any likely equation. There have been many offerings to the identification of our mystery man, but in reality we're hard pushed for clues. The first clue is that he was mummified in a similar way to the two royal princes. Although his bones were wrapped individually, his neck, elbows and ankles had wadding underneath the final linen wrap to give the mummy a lifelike contour. His eye sockets were lined with linen and pasteballs inserted, one might expect coloured to look like eyes. This could be owing to his death taking place many years before the final wrapping of his skeletal remains. If this is correct, it would also excuse the lack of a chapel. In other words, it was a secondary burial. As these burials are similar in many ways and in the same necropolis, primarily reserved for Sneferu's family, we can narrow the date down to around 4,613 to 4,589 years ago. And another thing, while we're informed the two princes were defleshed before burial, and therefore so is our mystery man, this equation does not sit right with me as a timeline. Our mystery man still had skin on the left side of his head and cheek. Why? Can we put it down to an apprentice deflesher not concentrating? No, I don't think so. I have mused over many ways in which this may have happened, and apart from the left side of the face and left top of head being exposed to the arid conditions of the Egyptian air, which dried the skin, scalp and hair in situ, while the rest of the body was exposed to a condition that exacerbated the decline of all other bodily tissue, I can find no other reason. But this seems bizarre. My only other offering would be a sky burial, where the body is laid out for the birds to eat, and perhaps, and that's a big perhaps, the head fell to the left side, which protected the skin from being eaten. A bit bonkers, I know, but it's a real puzzle, and if anyone has any other ideas, I'd love to hear them in the comments below. Now, let's get back to facts. Also in the sarcophagus were the remains of large bird bones. Gerald Avery Wainwright, 1879 to 1964, was a British archaeologist and Egyptologist who worked with Petrie before joining the staff of the Egyptian Antiquities Service. Of the bones, Wainwright states, "The remains of large bird bones in the sarcophagus are also a bit of a mystery. The humorous side of me would like to think that some vulture had perhaps eaten too much. And therein, my friends, lies the rub. Some have speculated 2 skulls of birds were present in the tomb, one perhaps of a goose, and one much smaller, perhaps a pigeon or dove. But Wainwright, there at the time of discovery, quite clearly states the large bones reminded him of a vulture. We'll go into that in a moment. Of the burial goods, Petrie states further, "Unfortunately, the thieves had scattered everything. All the vases, except one big one, were lying in the north and south passage, between the mouth of the gallery leading to the burial chamber and the south end of the passage, where the thieves had entered. A few black mud stoppers were found of the usual conical shape, but none of them bore any inscriptions. At the north end of the hall we found a single large vase, several ox bones and 4 model copper axe heads. In front of the coffin were lying many fragments of gold foil, several copper rods and model chisels, and another piece of ox bone. In the south end of the hall nothing was found." In order to work out who our mystery man was, we need to examine his remaining burial goods, what they may symbolise and what we may understand. Firstly, the ox bones. It is unlikely that an ox would have been buried with our mystery man, and therefore likely that the original owner of the ox bones were enshrined as a food offering for the afterlife. Copper models. A fantastic blog by Martin Odler, at the time working with the Czech Institute of Egyptology, Faculty of Arts, Charles University in Prague, and author of Old Kingdom Copper Tools and Model Tools, gives insight into the tomb gifts of copper axes and chisels, as well as other copper model grave goods. The picture you see on your screen right now is of a complete model toolkit with model blades of chisels, adzes, axes and saws, found in tomb AS27 of Abbasia South. Odler explains that early burial copper model goods do not necessarily mean that, for example, copper models of chisels were enclosed in graves of a person working as a stonemason or carpenter, but by those who could perhaps be of a social standing who could afford to commission such work, and like all other grave goods are seen as handy for the next life. So we learn the model copper axe heads may also fall into this category, and as grave goods simply represent objects needed for the afterlife. The mace was originally a functional weapon. Over time it became primarily symbolic. It symbolized the might of the pharaoh crushing his enemies. Could our mystery man be an early dynastic pharaoh, or high-ranking military official, or perhaps the pharaoh Honey himself? Two crooks. The shepherd's crook was closely associated with pharaonic rule and was even used to write the word ruler in hieroglyphics. But our mystery man had two. There is no attested historical documentation of any ancient Egyptian ruler, chieftain, military high-ranking official, or even low-ranking person with any association with two crooks, other than the well-documented Anjeti, ruler of Ati, the ninth nome of ancient Egypt, situated in Lower Egypt within the Nile Delta. It is believed Anjeti was a real ruler who became worshipped as a god after his death. His name, Anjeti, simply means he of Anjet. Anjet has been given many names over the years. For reference, the Greeks called it Busiris, and we'll come to that shortly. Anjeti is considered one of the earliest known Lower Egyptian local gods. In the earliest representation of Anjeti, he wears two crooks on his head, a crown. In later depictions as an old man, bearing all of the emblems of kingship, he wears a crown with two feathers. He was also honoured with the nickname Bull of Vultures, and is sometimes depicted as wearing a crown symbolising a uterus, thus clarifying one of his attributes as god of fertility. Anjeti's death is reported as drowning in the river during the night of a thunderous storm. Strangely, the pharaoh Sneferu is the first pharaoh depicted wearing the crown of Anjeti. The coffin text is a collection of spell-binding funerary spells and incantations inscribed on coffins and sarcophagi, which began in the first intermediate period around 4181 to 4055 years ago, after the end of the Old Kingdom. Here are a couple of examples. I immerse the waterways as Osiris, Lord of Corruption, as Anjeti, Bull of Vultures. O Thoth, vindicate Osiris against his foes, the great tribunal in the two banks of the Kite, on the night of the drowning of the great god in Anjeti. May your staff be the head of the spirits, as Anubis, who presides over the Westerners, and Anjeti, who presides over the Eastern gnomes. Horus has revived you in this, your name of Anjeti. The great god Horus was originally worshipped in Upper Egypt and portrayed in early wall etchings as far back as the Scorpion King from Dynasty 0. This is where it gets political. Pre-Pharaonic Egypt had many local gods, a little like the Sumerians of the day, with their chosen god named to represent their city or settlement. It was believed the god of your city would protect you. And so, as the warring tribes of Upper Egypt fought and won more cities and more land, other gods would become part of the substance of early dynastic religion. Some Egyptologists have named the original Horus of Upper Egypt Horus the Elder. Some gods who appeared to represent the same tributes were coupled to other gods, and this was good for everyone, as although their leader had undoubtedly been smashed over the head with a mace, at least their gods were safe and continued to be revered. By the time Lower Egypt fell and the two lands became one, there were numerous stories about the gods. Most today seem very confusing, to say the least. Anjeti, as we know, appears to have been a local leader, king or chieftain of the ninth known, who became a local god upon his death. The symbol of the ninth known was known as the Jed. As a hieroglyph, it came to represent stability and durability. Coincidentally, one of the earliest examples of the Jed was in Sneferu's step pyramid. The Jed pillars form columns supporting the sky and may represent the four pillars which help the god Shu bear the sky on his shoulders. Horus the Younger was a different god from Horus the Elder. He is seen as the son of Osiris and Isis, whom revenged the death of his father. Osiris was murdered by his brother Set, some say by tricking him into a wooden bejeweled coffin, which was then thrown into the river. There are several accounts of how Set murdered Osiris, but all say Isis brought Osiris back to life and was impregnated by her husband before he died again. This time, Set took the body of Osiris, chopped it up, and hid the parts throughout Egypt and along the Nile River. One story says a catfish ate Osiris's genitals. I often wondered if that catfish was the pharaoh Nama, whose name is symbolized by a catfish, and who is credited as uniting both Upper and Lower Egypt as one land. There is no documented evidence for the story of Osiris until after Sneferu's reign, and as far as the god Horus the Younger, well, the stories seem to get jumbled up and mixed about with Horus the Elder. It appears to have taken a few hundred years for the story of the god Osiris to become documented as the god of the underworld and the unification with Anjeti. In the pyramid text, which are reserved for pharaohs only, the deceased pharaoh is identified in death with Anjeti. In the temple of Seti I, the pharaoh is shown offering incense to Osiris Anjeti, who is accompanied by Isis. It may well be that Anjeti was coupled to the lesser known god Osiris from Upper Egypt, and the great story of Osiris was born. Could our mystery man be Pharaoh Honey himself? No, I believe not. If Pharaoh Honey had commissioned the tomb, why did it not carry his name either inside or out, and why the vulture and two crooks? No, I don't believe it is the final resting place of Honey. What's more, there is actually no documentation that states Honey built the step pyramid, or that Honey was ever associated with my doom. It has been assumed that Honey built the step pyramid at my doom because Honey is thought to have built many small step pyramids where he held estates. We know next to nothing about Honey, but we do opine Sneferu's wife was Honey's daughter, Hetepheres. Queen Hetepheres I was the principal wife of Sneferu and the mother of Pharaoh Khufu. An inscription on a chair recovered from her tomb describes her as mother of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, follower of Horus, guide of the ruler, favourite one, she whose every word is done for her, the daughter of a god's body, Hetepheres. Sneferu's eldest son, Nefermat, did not become his heir. Instead, Khufu, son of Queen Hetepheres I, and Sneferu became heir apparent and the next ruler. This, I believe, was owing to the royal bloodline of his mother. Nefermat was obviously born with no royal blood. Sneferu may have been an important, high-ranking official that married the royal daughter of Huni, and thus secured the throne for himself and a new dynasty. Huni's vizier's name was Khagmeni I. After Huni died, he became vizier to Sneferu. Upon Khagmeni's death, Nefermat became the king's vizier. We have no documentation of where Sneferu was born or his life up until he married Hetepheres I. It is said that perhaps Sneferu was also Huni's son by a different wife. If that was so, Sneferu would have royal blood. Therefore, his firstborn son would be heir, but that was not the case. It is said of Sneferu, aside from his engineering work, he was also favoured for his formidable military strategies. You should know that he was a valiant leader, and he ruled his army with might, which led him to win against neighbouring countries. His military achievements were talked about and feared by other nations. Could Sneferu have come from a noble family from the Nile Delta? Perhaps a high-ranking military family. Taken from Greek records, it states, the feared warriors of Lower Egypt, known as the Hermotabes by the Greeks, but also attested in other earlier sources, had been infamous for many hundreds of years. They came from the district of Anjet, Sais and other areas of the Eastern Delta. They apply themselves wholly to military affairs. Also taken from a Greek text. The town and nome of Busiris was allotted to the Hermotabean division of the Egyptian militia. It was regarded as one of the birthplaces of the god of the underworld, Osiris. As we know, Basir was the Greek name for Anjet. Is it possible Sneferu's family were from Anjet, or at least that area? And so before the name Osiris came on the scene, Sneferu was fully aware of Anjet's claim as a king and as a god. One last thought to consider. Our mystery man had a phallus made of linen to replace his own missing phallus. Could his original phallus have been chopped up by Nama, known as the catfish, in the battle to secure Lower Egypt? If so, this could explain why our mystery man was buried with a mace, not just as grave goods, but actually in his sarcophagus, and alongside his body lay 2 crooks and a vulture.